but only a mere 30 something centigrade.
It's 30 something Fahrenheit here.
I bet. Yeah. I can't believe that you sort of rebellious, tax dodging tea terrorists keep with the imperial measurements.
Well,
It's a standard trope of mine with my various American acquaintances every now and then, as in Happy Tea Terrorism Day or something similar.
Right.
And or things like Welcome to the War, late again.
Well, and that's what Rudyard Kipling was all about when he wrote the poem "The White Man's Burden." Right? It was, "Come on, America, let's get with the program. Follow us." He was living in upstate New York at the time he wrote that, I think. Kipling was.
Yeah. I must admit, I haven't done it fully yet, but I not even really in response to losing young Miss Elizabeth and gaining Right Charlie recently, but from the very short book that is Christopher Hitchens' review of Thomas Paine, and the fact that he was a pain in the arse over the pushing the revolution and all this. And then, of course, both at one point or another through his life is either a problem for the Brits or a problem for the Americans or a problem for the French. It just seemed to garner trouble no matter where he went.
Yeah, Paine fascinates me quite a bit. Yeah, I like.
Yeah, but I must admit I don't know his writing well enough, and I don't really know the period that much from a more political point of view.
Moncure Conway, who was another British expat living in New York, wrote a really pretty good biography of Paine. Hey, Lewis.
Say your name again.
Moncure, Moncure, Conway. He was sort of a British free thinker in the late 19th century. Came over to America. I think there's a Conway Hall actually in London where they used to hold kind of free thought, secular society meetings, which is named after him. And he
he's more of a friend, as in Quaker.
Well, he lived after. I mean, no, he lived at the end of the 19th century, and Paine died at the beginning. But he was a friend of Bradlaugh, for example, when Charles Bradlaugh was doing an American tour and got sick in New York. Conway made sure that he was treated well and recovered. So he was sort of an international. And he was a generation. He was of that end of the 19th century generation, not the generation. Most of the free thinkers who came were in the beginning of the century, like Robert Owen and Robert Dale Owen and Francis Wright, and all those people came over in the the 1820s, and some and then went back and forth more or less. But there was a lot of traffic across the Atlantic. There
was a couple of bits and pieces that crossed over just because of sideways reading and just noticing odds and sods was who, what, where, and when for things like the Ivy League universities and those first dozen or so big institutions.
Yeah. Well, and the historians, of course, also most of the first generation of of professional American historians were trained by the Germans. So there was that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of a lot of movement. Hey Pat, hey Chris, I'm going to sit down now. I think before, but I kind of like being seated.
Morning.
Hey, how are you?
Not too bad. In
I
fact,
got
actually, I
working again.
yeah. In fact, this week or the last couple weeks, I've been bits and pieces been reading parts of Ernst Bernheim from the late 1800s and Charles Victor Langlois and Charles Seniobos, who wrote some of the really early books on historical method. And interestingly, they include some chunks of material on Zettelkasten tradition.
Wow. You're casting a
So
wide
it's kind
net.
of, and what's interesting to me though is in an era of, I mean, no computer whatsoever, but slips were fairly commonly used. But both they and then later in 1926, I think Beatrice Webb's section on note taking in her book My Apprenticeship, they all talk about essentially data collection on index cards the way we would now in a modern context talk about collecting data and putting it into a database or an Excel spreadsheet to be able to sort through it and differentiate certain things. Webb goes even so far as to say, I would take a big chart and split it up into data into individual index cards so that you could then sort through them and make sense of the data the way you would sort through a database. And, to me, that's like, literally she's doing like very early database compilation and computer science. But, here she is, sociologist and historian. But she's doing really early computer science, and no, I don't hear anyone ever talk about that when we talk about the history of science or history of computing.
Yeah,
it's all Ada Lovelace this and
right, yeah, Babbage and Lovelace, and then it jumps to to find.
And then everybody wants to get into Vannevar Bush, who was interesting in the space, but really his grad students were doing all the actual groundwork.
Yeah, it's that would be actually, if I ever, because I did that, I sort of made that jump when I was teaching a history of high tech course. I sort of went from those, from the Jacquard Loom and Babbage and Lovelace and early and ideas about the universal language and stuff like that to kind of the the cryptography of the Second World War and and the things that came out of that. That would be kind of an interesting thing to kind of add in there, because and similarly at the same time the Webbs are doing a lot trying to intervene in kind of social conditions in England, and then then Booth goes around and does his his surveys of London, which probably I hadn't really thought about it until you just mentioned it, Chris, but that probably had the same type of data behind it that that Webb was probably trying to do, right? Because there's a lot of coordination of the map and the survey of the physically what's there, and then people's people's narratives and their comments about the living conditions and everything in each of those places. I mean, he mapped really the entire city of London. So there's probably a background in that as well. Yeah.
Oh, another fun thing I found this week too, and I read it I'm pretty sure I read it after we convened last week, but I found a small manual. It's like 37 pages, and there's a copy on archive.org by a Canadian historian by the name of Jacques Goutor, Goutor, who he's writing for his local historical society. And apparently he'd given a series of presentations in the late 70s on historical method and how to take notes on cards. And it's specifically geared towards amateur historians. But he talks about the method as so he's talking about note taking and referencing and properly citing things in some parts, but there's not a citation to be found in the entire thing. which to me, but because of what he's talking about, it makes it sound as if he's learned this note-taking method from someone else while he was in school, and he's used it for years, but never read a manual or any information on what this is and how to do it. So it's a presentation ostensibly of, here's how I've done this thing and here's how we can apply it. And so he writes, it's, like 30, 40 pages, but it's geared towards the people who are doing research for the local historical society to be able to write presentations for the society or the local library, or do little presentations. But it's an interesting
approaching
thing to have. It's an interesting to go from, almost 100 years earlier with Germans like Ernst Bernheim saying, here's how we do history, and this is the method, and within the method, here's how we take notes and do and sort all this stuff, to literally a century later, a historian actually talking about it with no citations whatsoever, talking about the same types of things, but in a much more oral method with zero history behind how this thing came about and why we do this. And he kind of presents it almost more as a, I've done this and it's worked for me and it could ostensibly work for you. And what's funny is he actually does have one citation, but it's a credit for a photo that a friend of his took of some people at a library doing some research. So which actually points to the fact that I know how to cite, and here is a citation, and here's a credit for this thing, but nothing else.
Right. Interesting. So,
but I thought you'd find it interesting, Dan, or your students might find it interesting because it's another version of, in particular, geared at historians and history students. And
thank you. Yeah, I'll look that up. I put a link to it in the chat. It looks like it'll be fun. I also read, last year sometime, I read a book, and I think I tried listening to it too, but it was just too dry. I don't think I got all the way through. About a guy who was interested in sort of cataloging all of the knowledge of the world. And so
wait, which one? There's so many.
Yeah, I'm scrolling to try to find it. I got too much unorganized stuff in my Kindle. I mean, it's just like, how am I going to organize this? I guess alphabetically by author or something. It was a book about, and this guy was he was all about kind of I won't find it right now. I'll post it if I find it. It was about his trying to create a sort of a library-ish system of organizing knowledge across disciplines, and so it's sort of that early period of of people messing around with that, and there's a yeah, our book suggestions list is missing some note takings. Yeah, so there were, and Lewis, I think you had put some things up about kind of climate, but then somebody else had said something about what Zolt is doing, and those were the list of things that linked to was sort of general thinking kind of stuff. It seemed to me.
Yeah, it was a book list of just general climate research and like books about that. Since we've been talking about that also as a subject, and then I think somebody who was it Pat put up another list from the climate, or link to the climate web.
Oh,
Pat also had some.
Oh, okay, yeah, I wasn't sure who, because yeah. Oh, and then Lisa's not here yet. I was wondering if she was going to come today.
No, she's put up a note in the vault, but like
yeah.
Yeah, but there are a few books in our book suggestion list, like the Donut Economics, for instance, that is sort of linked to climate change. And we've got some other history books that look quite interesting, but like nothing about note taking.
Yeah,
which might be something.
Yeah, and
something
or maybe something, or maybe I don't want to listen to his thing. I thought he was just going to have a. Oh, I see. It's a whole. All right, I'll watch his video at some point and see what it is that he's really suggesting. Because maybe there's something along the kind of some of those things that I'm just looking at the titles now kind of look interesting. And maybe. Yeah, I can't think of another. I mean, there's nothing really that I personally have queued up on note taking that I've been kind of waiting to do. And another thing I guess that we might do is we might, rather than a book, we might kind of survey, some of the things that people have out there that, out on the web, or kind of available in digital form that that we might kind of take a look at. Like Andy Matuszak or the kind of the LYT stuff. There's enough there that we could look at it and kind of gather what it is. See if there's anything in there that kind of resonates for us. Go ahead, Lewis. Sorry.
I've got in my long list a book called Index: A History of the by Dennis Duncan. But I don't know if you or Chris have heard of it. Might be worth just finding out a bit more information about it.
Sure. Okay. Yeah,
if you want to go that note-taking route with odd, quirky stuff, I mean, unless there's some like big manual or if somebody wanted to delve into like Umberto Eco's, he's got a big long discussion, or Weinberg's book on the field, what he calls the fieldstone method, is interesting, but they, those are kind of dense and get into the weeds. But I have and I'll throw it out. It's broadly called Tools for Thought, but I have a large and ever-growing list of journal articles that kind of fit into that area. and it's split up into areas on note taking and thinking in general. There's even some stuff on user interface. But there's some interesting kind of denser articles. And as an example, I found one this week about he was born in Germany and moved to the United States and was a professor of history and specialized in Jewish history. Gotthard Deutsch, who was from the late 1800s-ish. And he had a card index of 70,000 cards that primarily focused on Jewish history. But there was a modern academic paper that came out probably 2 or 3 years ago on his index. And the guy was not an expert on note-taking or Zettelkasten in a general sense, but had read enough references that he knew of, like Marcus Krajewski. But he had a much more information and knowledge about the history of Judaism in particular, and had read a bunch of this guy's works separately. And I think there are some things he missed, but in what he misses, and he doesn't get, like, the guy wrote a fair amount, and particularly wrote for newspapers and magazines in the popular press of his day, and was working on an encyclopedia. And I see in some of what he's doing similar things to what Mortimer J. Adler was doing. But in some sense, this academic is saying, this guy had this massive kind of vault of data, but he ostensibly didn't use it. And then the question really is, well, I seeing it from the other side, I think he totally used his database. He just used it for things that weren't necessarily, he didn't have the massive output that Luhmann did.
Right.
But I think he had a significant enough output that it's obvious he used it for his encyclopedia project, and apparently was a major contributor to this, historical encyclopedia that he was working on.
Interesting.
And very likely used it for teaching, because he was a big and well-known and very popular professor.
What was his name again?
Here, I'll type it into the thing. It's Gotthard Deutsch.
Oh, okay.
TSCH.
Okay, cool. So I found the book that I was mentioning in my long list. It was called Cataloging the World, and it was about Paul Otlet and the birth of the information age by Alex.
But who is the author, Dan?
Alex Wright. I'll put it in the chat as well.
I haven't done as much reading on Otlet or the Mundanium, but that was a bigger, it was one of the bigger cataloging projects since Gessner. But I think it was a multi-person effort, as I recall, and they had millions and millions of cards they collected, and then were interrupted by the war.
Right. Yeah. It seemed like it had it sort of had its it stood in the center of kind of a bunch of interesting things, museums and archives and catalogs and all of that stuff. And he was he kind of connects a bunch of I like these people that I've never heard of who sort of link a bunch of things that I am kind of aware of. So we can to respond to what Tim said in the chat. Yeah, we should I mean, this stuff will go in the chat afterwards, but yeah, we should probably use that list in the vault as as kind of a place to really, nominate the things that we're really serious about, maybe wanting to read together. And that said, do we want to jump to Poorly Understood? Oh, thank you. Thanks, Chris. Wow, a shared
Don't go down the rabbit hole with that.
shared Zotero collection. That is the bomb. Wow, nice.
Yeah, I just ruined your weekend there.
Yeah. Yeah, you did. That is cool. Yeah, I've got to. I was thinking about, I'm making this for my my U.S. history class. I'm making this primary source anthology, and I did the thing in Pressbooks where you export the print PDF, and then because I was thinking that's what I did with the How to Make Notes book, and I thought, well, I could use that same technique, and I'm not going to be able to use it because it came out to like 990 pages, and I'm only halfway through. So clearly that's not going to work. The way they format it, for kind of ease of ebook use doesn't translate well in this case into print. So I'm rethinking ways of actually making that into and maybe cutting it into obviously sort of more smaller volumes. But in any case, do we want to jump over to Poorly Understood?
We can. My first observation, and I don't think we talked about it last week. I mean, this is a good broad popular press book for this topic, and then there's little bits and pieces I'm finding that are kind of interesting and unique that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think big broad chunks of what they're talking about in their broader thesis I was aware of and knew were myths, but didn't have data to back them up. So they're kind of doing it well on that kind of broad structure. And I do like the fact that it's very accessible what they're writing. It's not super dense, although I kind of wish it were slightly more dense and a little more kind of academic-y to pull more interesting, quirky stuff out of. But I do find I'm maybe a little annoyed that it's as repetitive as it is. So they've got a handful of ideas and they're repeating all the big ones at least twice, if not 3 times in some cases, which is a bit much.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find is some of their presentation too often says, here's the myth first, and then here's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that, and I think that there's a reasonable amount of research to back this up. In particular, I would cite George Lakoff, who's now a retired linguist, who talks about, and he's got a framing that he calls the truth sandwich, that you should present the truth first and then talk about the lie or the myth with respect to what the truth is. Mm-hmm. And then when you finish, then you say the truth again the third time or the second time to repeat it, so that the people who walk away from the thing have been mired more in the truth of what the topic is than the myth in the middle. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. But when you lead with the myth, that tends to reinforce the bias that you came with. Mm-hmm. And then you don't hear the reframing and the actual truth of the thing. And in almost every case, in all their chapters and pieces, I find myself thinking that no, you're framing this the wrong way. Make it a truth sandwich and say, here's what it really is. Here's the myth. And they do a reasonable job of saying this is why we believe the myth
Mhm.
and why it makes sense, this myth that we've been telling. But because they're repeating everything twice, they're saying here's the myth and then here's the truth and here's the truth again.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're doing themselves a favor with that structure.
I think I agree with you. I think that and I think that the fact that they, that each of these people has individually done a lot with these topics is, kind of both a plus and a minus, right? On the one hand, they can say, okay, here's a deeper, I'm gonna cite my own. Like I'm looking at the beginning of chapter 6, right, where they begin sort of by citing themselves in more articles and things, and which probably are exactly what you're asking for, Chris, right? The more kind of the better, the more successfully sort of framed things. The other element of the downside of that is okay, we've been working on this for the last 25 years, and and it's it's like who's the audience? Is this the sense that I'm getting is that this is like a supplementary text for an undergraduate, first or second year undergraduate class kind of thing, where
I think it's written broadly enough that, even the general public who's interested in it, but the issue I think is, who is that broad general public that's going to pick this up as their light weekend reading?
Right. Yeah.
Aside, and I would say us as a group, we're bringing a huge amount of our own bias with us as we're reading it,
Mhm.
and reading it because of our bias in some sense. I'm not reading this and finding like huge amounts of interesting insight that I didn't already have.
Right.
But it's nice to have some pointers to delving in further.
Mhm.
But I think if I were reading this by myself, I would have pulled out 3 deeper references and started reading those and given up on this.
Mhm. Yeah.
If for our broader group.
Right. And it doesn't, and in a sense, it is more, it's kind of more responsible than maybe, a David Graeber would be, but Graeber would be more interesting, right? He'd go all the way to the fringe and, and take it off, off the edge into the abyss, right? Drive off the edge of the world, kind of thing, which is, so maybe this is more, and maybe this is the thing that sort of reaches across the aisle, right? And begins to, that would be, that would be valuable if this, if this is effective doing that, right? Kind of convincing people who are not, but I think the truth sandwich, I agree, it would be a better way to do that, because if someone puts it down and all they've read was that, hey, Ronald Reagan said the war on poverty has been lost, then wrong message. You have to keep going.
Or they, some of it too comes down to over the past, and probably even more than the past decades, but even within my life, it seems more like we're treating the symptoms of poverty than poverty itself.
Mhm.
And I don't know if they brush up against it, but I don't feel like they're coming out and saying we need to treat the actual disease and not treat to the symptoms.
Mhm.
But almost all of the and the majority of them tend to be features on the right, or that the right will come up with answers and solutions, and they're only treating the symptoms. We see all this crime and the crime issue, so let's treat the crime. Let's not treat the underlying root of the crime to make we could have no crime if we treated the underlying thing and at a fraction of the cost. But it's easier from a political standpoint to jump up and down and spew fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Right.
Well,
I
think they could do a better job of mentioning that.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that has worked for me and that's been valuable for me is this, this kind of evidence to support the idea that poverty is not a character flaw; it's a condition of economic circumstances, right? And so the idea that people, I mentioned last week. I mentioned that that Thurnston and Knight's article about persistence and transience in the poor population in Boston back in early American history. And I think it's the same thing with poverty, right? I think that's the thing. That's really kind of the aha moment for me that they could have leaned more into and developed more fully is this idea that because. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Pat. Also, this idea that there are, that there's an education element going on. There is certainly a way to be better prepared for, for a shift in the local economy or the closing of a plant or that kind of thing that we often kind of typically think puts people out of work and destroys the economy of a Rust Belt city, that sort of thing. And so more resilience is a potential kind of solution. But even so, right, there's another later on in one of the later chapters in this section, there's a thing that I highlighted that said that that there are, in 2000, on page 46, in 2000, when the economy was close to genuine full employment, the unemployment rate was 4% and the poverty rate was 11.3%, right? So again, we're measuring the wrong things, right? We're measuring this, as if it is a stock when in fact it's a flow, right?
Or are we watching the right numbers? So, literally every week for the last 2 years or almost on a daily basis, I hear unemployment numbers on the radio, on the news.
Yeah.
And you never hear poverty numbers are never reported. And the other thing that, they generally don't report is corporate profits.
Yeah.
If we heard about corporate profits in the aggregate,
in the
not
context
just
of
how did Amazon do today, but
right.
What did corporate America extract from, the public today or this week or this year? And you hear it every day.
Yeah.
In addition to here's the poverty number, and you put those two things together every day in your regular reporting.
Yeah.
Then it makes more. It highlights it, and you're more likely to get the change because you measure what you find important.
Well, and especially if there's if and a lot of that reporting when it does happen kind of comes out of some type of a not a Marxist but an influenced by Marx kind of a labor theory idea that that there is that the owners of capital are extracting more than their fair share because they control the institution of a Walmart or an Amazon. Yeah. And this, and it would be valuable. I think you're right, Chris, to say, okay, this is Walmart's quarterly profit. And this is the number of, Walmart associates, employees who are on public assistance, right? Because they're not earning enough to be out of poverty.
Here's the 100,000 employees and how much they made in comparison to
the Walton family, right?
Or here's the weekly report of all the cleanup we're putting onto the voting public
Mhm.
for the disaster or the spill or the mining facility that closed down. They're done extracting all their value out of the land, and now they're leaving the mess for.
Right. Right. Yeah, that was the thing that they said they wanted to do, the sulfite mining up in right near the between the Iron Range in northern Minnesota and the Boundary Waters canoe area. And they said, yeah, it'll be fine though. Yes, the tailings ponds will have to be maintained for 500 years, but trust us, we're good for it.
Yeah,
Like,
we'll,
okay.
we'll trust you, but I want it in escrow in advance, and
Yes.
then when it's all done and we've been able to trust you, then you can take
And you
those
can have the money
corporate
back. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. You can have the extra. And nobody ever does that.
Right. Right. Yeah. 500 years. Yes. Because Glencore Xstrata has got that kind of staying power. I think the idea for me, the powerful idea in this was that, a much larger percentage of the population, we will sort of cycle through these periods of difficulty, than can actually be measured today as being in poverty. Right. And so this idea, and they didn't quantify it, I didn't think very well, but this idea of sort of cognitive load that is on, people who are, trying to juggle this, this relationship of, and part of it is not only, trying to count every penny and make, and get all the bills paid and stuff, but part of it is also, I think I think there's a psychological element there that goes kind of with that, that dependency, right? That the solution is a public solution. I was reading in my equity class this week. We were reading. We sort of went back to race and talked about the civil rights movement, and I had them read a couple of Martin Luther King things, the Washington speech, I Have a Dream speech, and then the letter from the Birmingham jail. And then I also had them read the speech that Malcolm X made in Detroit just before he left, when he was no longer with the Nation of Islam, but just before he went on the Hajj. And then I also had them read a passage from Fred Hampton, which was much more aggressive, but was talking about, and one of the things that I thought was interesting was that there was in each of them, but especially in Fred Hampton, right, when he's talking about the Black Panthers, there was this element of, no, we're going to do it, right? We're not gonna, and he tells this story about, the community wanting a stop sign, right, because people are getting run over, and they ask for the stuff. They go to the town, the city council meetings, and they ask for it, and they ask for it, and they ask for it. I am making it up kind of as I go, Chris, but yes, I can, I can post something. I should. In the long run, I would like that class to be really fully HyFlex, right, where there is actually an outward facing element of it. Right now, I'm sort of putting it together as I go by the skin of my teeth. But Hampton is saying, we went down, so we didn't do that. We went to the and he makes the point of, we armed ourselves, right, and we went and we put a stop sign in, but fully armed, so that if they came to ask us, we could defend ourselves. And of course the students kind of focused on that a little bit more than on the direct action thing. But then later on, he's talking about food for kids, right? They had this, this food program, breakfast program for school children, right? And they're doing that. And one of the ladies who's running that is getting hassled by the cops because, hey, this is communist. And her response is, I don't care what you call it, right? This is what we're doing. And he tries to make, and he's, I think when he writes this, he's only like 19 or 20 years old. So it's very, it's very sort of youthful and bombastic and stuff. But you can already see he's trying to make this point about, it's not about theory. I don't care about, being a pure socialist theoretically. I care about doing stuff for people, right? And that's the community, and that's what that's what we're going to show people socialism is. And it's almost what Graeber says about the sort of the personal communism of families and small communities, right? Which sort of bypasses that whole question of having to sort of stake a big theoretical political position. And that kind of fascinated me because you don't expect to, I don't know, you don't always expect that level of a kind of common sense. I was very inspired by that. But this idea that the number of, and actually to go back to what you were saying, Chris, the unemployment numbers, I've always thought about, the thing that when I see the unemployment numbers, I always think about, okay, so what about all of the people who are, who are not even part of the system anymore, or not even counted because they've stopped, because what the numbers measure are the people who have applied for benefits, right? So you've got this additional population of people who are out of the system because they've given up, or they've aged out of it because they've already had all the benefits they could possibly have. So I've always thought of that initial number, but now this is sort of kind of cluing me into also the fact that in any given period, like Thernstrom and Knights were saying about Boston, okay, the population, you have a census every 10 years, and the population of Boston goes from 200,000 to 300,000. So that's a lot of people, 100,000, right? But in fact, in those 10 years, 1 million people came and left. It's just that 100,000 of them were still there at the end, right? And so so thinking of it in that in that kind of dynamic sense, I think it makes the argument even. Come on, guys, you can't put me on the desk. That makes the that I think that just makes the thing even more compelling. That
that's the other thing too that they're not mentioning either are the additional hidden taxes of this lack of resiliency. So let's say you face a bout of poverty for a year and a half, and you can't pay your rent, so you get evicted.
Mm-hmm.
Your credit rating is not only heavily dinged because you were in debt, but the fact that you got an eviction that's now attached to your record.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen people use the phrase the Scarlet E to refer to an eviction. That now acts as a drag and a tax on your personal balance sheet that you carry forward forever.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least 7 years. And if you got a bankruptcy, it's tagged onto you for 7 years. So not only did you have a bout of poverty that ostensibly, based on their data, you may recover from and come out of reasonably rapidly, but you've now got this massive anchor around your neck that you're dragging with you for the rest of your life.
Right.
Which also makes it less likely that you'll be resilient to combating future bouts of that same type of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But those types of unseen taxes that society puts on people, we don't add those kind of unseen taxes to corporations,
right?
Or corporations have the ability to band together and fight against it. I don't know if it was in this that I wrote the note or something else, but I was reading something this week that was essentially talking about the ability of people to band together and organize and it wasn't even in a union setting, but it was just a political, if you're a corporation and you've got the expertise and the ability to get together with other corporations to then lobby,
Mhm.
you're in a much better position.
Sure.
But it's very rare that you see the poor and the indigent band together and lobby at the same level or the same type of way.
Mhm.
And it's literally the ability to put together a group to do that gives you as a group power within the political system.
Yeah.
And because of the way poverty works, you are never ever going to see that happen in at least the American political system.
Right. Right. Well, yeah.
We can wave our hands at it and say, oh, but you can organize and show up at the polls to change things.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
all evidence indicates that is never ever going to happen.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, and even if you do come back, right, and you're not really and you're not really damaged that much by the change in your credit rating or the Scarlet E or whatever, there's still I think a period of fragility on either side of that period of poverty that that needs to be kind of accounted for. The other thing that kind of struck me this week, I was thinking that I was going to kind of have done with Martin Luther King this week and then move on, and then I realized afterwards because we did the two Martin Luther King readings on Wednesday, and then we did the Malcolm X and the Fred Hampton on Friday. And I realized I have to come back one more time, and I'll wait a couple of weeks, but I'm going to come back to King when he pivots toward poverty, right? And when he starts, when he sort of opens up the tent a little bit and starts talking, because already in the Malcolm X speech and in the Hampton speech, they're already, the students have already read that, and these, they're not all chronologically the same. I think the Malcolm X thing was closer to King, and then the Fred Hampton was like in 1969. So so already King is dead, and and so it's easier for Hampton to say. It's kind of weird. You take these things out of you take them out of their historical moment, and you sort of put them next to each other. It's like, well, why is Hampton saying that this is not the problem of just the Black community. This is the problem of the brown community and the yellow community and the red community and, and all of the non-white, and, and already kind of turning that corner and saying, we need to have a single, we need to have, we need to not be divided and conquered, right? And an awareness of that, which I think is a huge element. One of the things that I would, be in favor of kind of maybe reading in the future in this group is something that sort of addresses that, sort of the why can't people in America, I mean, because in American history, we've been very bad at kind of forming these social coalitions, right? Of, I mean, for a minute, we had a People's Party, right, that combined the Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliances, right? But then that was gone. Right? We've never been very good at seeing the problems of poor urban people and the problems of poor rural people similarly, right? Or or the races. I mean, even worse, right? I mean, there are so many pressure points for us being divided and conquered that it would be might be interesting.
That's the whole definition of the phrase wedge issues is if you're the people in power, you want to find those wedges to drive those two or three groups, especially if they're big, and separate them and split them up. So even in the women's movement from 1900 on, there are definite differences between the white women who want some sense of power and the marginalized Black, brown, and every other woman who who also want something, and in a broad scope, they want the things that women want, but there are also differences between them and other things that the marginalized people also want above and beyond. And the white woman agenda drove the market. And once they kind of got what they needed, they gave up instead of saying, well, now let's go fix, or at the same time, let's fix that other underlying problem that the rest of the group wants and needs.
Right.
And that literally that became a wedge that split those groups up, and hurt a lot of momentum in the late 70s, especially.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think that was,
and that was the beginning.
I mean, and in the first,
figuring out
and in the first wave as well, in the beginning, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, right? So yeah, I mean, I think I mean, the book that I have that I actually would like, that I've kind of listened to once and would like to go back to and look at more, and maybe sort of mine its sources a little bit more, is Thomas Frank's book on populism, which is called The People Know. Because I think he wrote that at a moment when one of the big questions in people's minds was, what happened in the 2016 election, right? We had this sort of populist revolt on the left, and we had this populist revolt on the right. What's going on here? Why is the center not holding? And I think that would be, it would be interesting to see if there's a way forward from that to some type of kind of way of and for me, of course, I want to talk to undergraduates about it too, and I want to kind of have them kind of come through this educational system, which my university is it's mostly for first generation students who are from working class backgrounds, and oftentimes working students, adults working. We have we're super focused on on trying to move people from my system has 7 universities and 31 community colleges, right? And so we're all of a sudden super focused, and it's partially well, how do we control, how do we get a handle on enrollment, but also they're really kind of starting to see their mission as as this, to whatever extent they're right about in these passages here, in pages 48 and 49, when they're talking about human capital theory and and years of education corresponding, correlating, and probably there being a causal relationship, right, between education and median income. That these are the things that we want to focus on, but along the way, we get these people who come in with all of these different, and we're a little blue town in a very red part of the state, and so so we want to kind of address, and actually this this would probably be the type of, if it did get, I think I agree with you, Chris, if it did get truth sandwichized in an edit, then it would be a way to kind of address this. And I also think that that The People Know, or something like that, would be a good way. And I think that Frank actually has been sort of working on sort of populism, and I mean he's got like 3 or 4 books, beginning with like what's wrong with Kansas. So a center party would be interesting. What's that about, Pat?
Well, I think his name is Yang, former candidate for president.
Oh yeah.
Was on TV the other day about the Forward Party, where they're trying to take elements from the left and the right. The Center Party, which has been missing in the recent years, more or less, and create a new party. I haven't seen much about it, just an article the other day about it, so I thought I'd throw it in.
Mm. Well, Yang can afford that. He's a billionaire, but how is anyone else going to? Yeah, that will be the question, right? Is, you know, how do we get corporate money out, and even the, you know, kind of even the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, Fritz. A lot of
I
it's
was,
the fun.
just
Oh, go ahead.
wondering- sorry, I was just wondering, like, it might be interesting comparing Europe and Finland even to the USA. I put up a page about the income inequality comparison, the Gini score, and like I noticed that the US and the UK with a two-party system rate pretty low on that compared to, say, the Scandinavia. But that you know, that gets us into a whole another like question how the political system works. It's like speaks to the goes back to speaks to like the causes of this all. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is a really I think that, you know, I mean, and even in this, right, they talk about, you know, that single family households in Denmark do better than, you know, than dual family in the United States. So but it's interesting, Louis, that you connect that with the two-party system, and I agree with you. I think that the and actually I talked to my students a little bit about that when we were talking about Lahontan and Candirong, which I made them read, and you know, the idea that, you know, that there is something different about having to achieve consensus, you know, and you know, and I tried to kind of walk them through that idea that, you know, that what do you do, you know, if you're sitting at a table with someone and you have to all agree before you get up on the table, right? Versus if you're in a two-party democratic situation and all you need is 50% plus one vote, right? Then what type of negotiating plan do you go to the table with, right? And how does that?
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, in Finland, like our you know, like if our president or prime minister does something controversial, it's because, you know, they haven't paid for their breakfasts, or there's a video of them partying a little bit too hard. You know, if you have to have a coalition to govern, you've got to be acceptable to the parties quite often to either side of you, just one step right or one step left, for example.
Right. So I think it could be argued that, you know, a more parliamentary system would be at least a step in that right direction, right? Of being a little bit more open to, you know, it's not 50% plus one. And I think the other thing that we have here now is we have this sort of all or nothing, you know, kind of winner take all, zero sum thing that comes out of this two-party contest, right? Where we don't have to. I mean, and it's, I don't know if the thing that happened in the last, you know, 4 to 8 years was inevitable, but, you know, this idea that you can completely write off and dehumanize the other side it might be inevitable.
Yeah, both USA, the UK, it's literally Reds against Blues.
Yeah,
my team against yours.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that buried in there also is is that question of, you know, what is it that people are feeling they've been left behind. I mean, there's so many, there's this, you know, this kind of left behind, you know, idea that is part of our culture now. That is that is on the left and on the right. It's kind of weird. I've been it just
Maybe,
fascinates
I
me.
don't know, maybe it's that group of people. Like I think it says in the book in the first section, we just mentioned it as well. Like the majority of Americans will experience some sort of poverty in their lives. I think it's that group of people who are maybe not like poor, but like can just look behind them and see the, you know, the floor falling, you know, underneath them, or, you know, that they can feel the cold on their shoulder.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and then it goes on to, you know, to these other, you know, just weirder and more, you know, and for me, you know, just darker, you know, kind of things, you know, this, you know, that in the 80s, you know, 15% of Black male high school dropouts could expect to spend some time in prison, you know, but now it's more than 2/3. So that has got to have just huge consequences in, you know, in terms of, you know, people just not believing that they are part of this society, you know.
Yeah, that from an evolutionary and sociological perspective, you know, humans have always been fairly hierarchical, and there's always somebody at the top and somebody at the bottom. And, you know, you can see in the, you know, great chain of being in particular is, you know, going way back to Aristotle and probably well before, there's a thing at the top and a thing at the bottom, and we all need to be hierarchically ordered, rather than a more indigenous perspective. You know, it's not just us, it's us as a group, but us along with the world and along with nature as the polar opposite. So you have, you know, when you say kind of that idea of being left behind and being marginalized, and, you know, and a lot of the people who have been left behind have been left behind so badly and so often and so frequently, they know there's no hope. But because of that hierarchical ordering, and I think it's one of the things that's interesting in this book, that they are kind of banging the drum. It's not just the people who are poor are in some part the people you think are poor, but the greater majority who are white who are poor. But from a political perspective and a storytelling perspective, it's that hierarchy in part that matters. So the power base at the top, the 1% who runs most of the politics, can point to kind of the white poor in the middle bottom and say, well, at least you're better off than these group of people who are even further below you. And to some extent, the polarization we're seeing, the opposite idea of that kind of being left behind, is that idea of, and to a great extent, it's the people who have just enough money and power below the marginalized, who are white, who are walking around saying, you know, phrases like, we will not be replaced. It's not so much being replaced that they're worried about, they're worried about their economic status is right on the fringe of being as bad as or worse than the people below them, who are ostensibly could replace them in an economic standpoint, if not something else.
Right.
But if you're so focused on trying to not be at the dead bottom that you don't see, things like gerrymandering or
Mhm.
other grift that's going on way above you.
Right.
I think I saw a political cartoon this week of a person in jail, and there's a loaf of bread and a key for the jail door just outside of the cell, and they've got a stick, and they're trying to pull the piece of bread in, and I think the caption on it was, if you keep them busy worrying about basic needs, they'll forget about the freedoms that they've lost.
Right. Right.
And I think to a great extent, the national story that we tell ourselves, the myth, is, this idea of American exceptionalism and we're the best,
Mhm.
Totally decimates the fact that we're not watching out for each other
Yeah.
and lift everyone up.
Right.
And instead we're lifting up the 0.001%.
Yeah.
At a magnitude of order higher than they really need to.
Yeah. I think you're right, Chris. And I agree with what Tim said about the CEO. I think that somehow we need to focus attention back at that question, right? That the reason that we are fighting over the scraps, right, is because that's all that the system has left to us, and we've been trained somehow to believe that this is a zero-sum game, right? And that if the that if the people crossing the border, take our jobs, then we're screwed. And that is I think that is difficult, I think, to communicate to people without their minds immediately going to the you're on Marx's side kind of place. And that's one of the things that I've sort of been struggling to try to figure out how to do is to sort of make young people who come from poor, resentful, and yet still red kind of families, understand that we've been boxed in by this system in a way that that if we could break out of it, that might give us more room for movement. Go ahead, Tim.
So a couple of examples I was thinking from old UK and current UK. The poverty question, there's a story related by Terry Pratchett, which I don't think is necessarily original to him, but he's the one that comes up when you Google for it. It's the story of the $10 and the $50 pair of boots. The poor person can't afford $50, so he buys the $10 boots, but he has to buy them every month. Whereas the $50 boots will last him a whole year.
Yeah. Because
of other budget constraints, rent, food, all the basic stuff. And he can afford the $10, but it never allows him to buy the $50 boots. So you can find that in various places within Terry Pratchett's slightly more political comments than some of these more funny science fiction stuff.
Yeah. Which also goes to kind of the renting versus owning world, the new world order that we're supposed to be entering.
That said, in the UK, for instance, we have a ownership bias for our homes, whereas if you go to Germany, it's the other way up. partly because they never had a Maggie Thatcher type session that got rid of selling to the tenant of all the local authority housing. So two places where I've lived the most, so North London and Bath, Maggie managed to get the right to buy as part of the tenancy agreement, particularly for all those where the local authority were the owners. So in the process of doing that, it weakened the local authority, who were more often than not, compared to the central government, more liberal come socialist. And of course, those people working in those areas are not looking to make money. So the employees of those areas were more left than right. And then, of course, more recent politics is there was a scheme which I think started under Cameron, but it might have been May, for the less well-off to be given a grant to insulate their house as part and parcel of the COP25-26 supposedly legally binding agreement for the UK to reduce its carbon footprint.
Right.
Boris gutted the scheme, and such that the scheme still existed, but you materially had less than 10% chance that you had under the original scheme. So eventually, a number of people that liked the scheme, they may not have been able to apply because they were too rich even, but they liked the idea, started to sit across the freeway in and out on the main ring road that goes around London. And they would do alternate junctions, 3 or 4 of them on a morning. Semi after the rush hour, but still at the. And so, of course, this is when Boris and his team, and now Lizzie number 3, have pushed the courts to make an example. The government's now relented and had to put the scheme back into a bigger than Boris left it scheme. And the last lot of people to go through the court system have been told by the judge, you are free with no record. 30 minutes blockage for something that is this important is proportionate. So all of a sudden, those that are supposedly on the inside of the system are beginning to break out, such that, of course, the government now doesn't know where it's going to go. And of course, the judges as a group effectively have a range of political affiliation, bias, and all the rest of it. But they do sort of shift slowly together as a package, because that's how the law works. And so since XR's been going and people have been sitting down in bank doorways, in oil company doorways, breaking glass windows, sitting on tops of trains, or as has happened in a slightly different way, where people have heard of bad extradition because you are black or you are not white, where people are being literally nabbed off the streets by the authorities, like your ICE. There's a group, I'm not quite sure exactly what they're called, but as the immigration people will go and raid businesses to check visas and all that stuff. Every now and then they manage to get 4 or 5 people, they try and stuff them on a plane. So what happens is some of the protesters go and get a ticket. or they surround the police vehicle with several hundred people, so the police vehicle can't move.
Mhm.
And then, of course, it's not really a police vehicle. It's only these immigration people, but it looks like a cop.
Mhm.
Then the police turn up and escort the immigration people away because they're at risk
Mhm.
of causing an affray. And the affray would only happen because they're there. So the immigrant goes scree again. Or I said, process back it. And then just before the doors are closed, they all stand and refuse to get in their seats. Plain clue.
Mhm.
And then, of course, under Boris's government, the UK government had an arrangement with all places, Rwanda, to ship all of our failed immigrants.
Failed immigrants. Yeah.
Of all places,
Yeah.
where currently the governments of Rwanda and next door, whatever it was, are currently in the International Court for Genocide.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, you know, an historical equivalent would be, instead of sending all these poor Poles back to Poland after World War II, we only sent them to East Germany.
Yeah.
But there was an agreement out of Yalta that the Russians and the Poles would all go back to the Soviet side of it,
Mhm.
whereas quite a few of the Czechs managed to stay. Not many of the Poles did. And they were literally at gunpoint, marched onto boats and planes,
Mhm.
going back to Poland and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the operation, but there's a bit like Operation Paperclip for getting all the Nazi scientists and technicians out to be
Mhm.
able to do the space program, etc.
Right.
There is an operation, whatever it's called, to send those people that were about to become citizens of the Warsaw Pact, even if they were on British soil or on Western controlled Germany, Brussels, Belgium, France, etc. They got shipped.
Mhm.
So there's been trouble for May, trouble for Boris, and trouble for Liz,
Yeah.
all because of Insulate Britain and amongst other people.
Right.
So,
Well, one of the things that strikes me about this, though, is that it seems to also be about scale, right? That there are things that the national government wants to do that, you know, that people locally are organizing to try to prevent, and that's one of the things that fascinates me as well. That there's, you know, that we tend to talk about, you know, sort of right and left at a national political level, right? This, you know, this red versus blue tends to be very, you know, very sort of focused on, you know, sort of full on national foreign policy, nationally enforced domestic policies. But then at a state level in the US, and I assume it's similar other places, you know, in the US, at a state level, at a local, you know, at a city, you know, big city municipal level, and then especially in, you know, in neighborhoods and wards in big cities and in, you know, in small communities out in the rest of the states, I think that people need to realize that the things, and this is also something that I got out of Graeber and Wengrow, I think also that you know, that these different levels of operation, you know, we behave differently in them, and we, you know, and you know, and they talked about, I think in The Dawn of Everything, they talked about, you know, being a conservative at the national level, and and kind of a moderate at the state level, and a liberal at the local level, and a socialist at the family level. And, you know, and that all of these thoughts kind of go, you know, that we can identify the fact that that's happening, and then learn to sort of accommodate those different thought forms in some type of way.
It's one of those things that came over with looking at the rural poor, particularly the rural poor, have got this element of we need a co-op, and I think I've mentioned this before in this context. We need a co-op to allow all of the co-op to take all of our crops to go and make a better deal with the buyer. So if you took that into a context outside of this township with its 15 or 20 different farmers, all doing the 400 acres type size farms, and you made that something slightly bigger, you would get certain people at the top saying that's communist. Right? They will be semi-right to a certain extent. However, what happens to people? I've got a friend who's a photographer who lives on Prince Edward Island, except he got almost blown off Prince Edward Island 10 days ago by Fiona.
Mm-hmm.
So he's lost his studio. He had no power. He's a Canadian. He used to live in Yukon territory, and he moved all the way across to Prince Edward about a year, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less. And he has 2 chainsaws, because all Canadians have chainsaws, right?
Sure.
And so he got power back the day before yesterday, right? And they were literally shipping electrical type engineers from all over Canada just to try and get it back on, because the only place in Canada that was really splattered was that. How is that not socialist? Right? They're not from the same corporation. Before I moved out to Dubai, there was a summer flood in central UK that caught me right on the edge. So there was one day I couldn't go to work because I couldn't get off. I lived on a little bump, so I didn't actually get wet. I'm just surrounded by water. Right? So if you look at, I think it's 2006 or 2007, the Gloucester and the River Severn areas flooded. But my immediate area, one of the things that went underwater was the water supply plant.
Mm.
So I got no water coming out the tap,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's very few people that are effectively off grid for water supply in the UK. The following that literally the day the water stopped the plant going, the army turned up and were starting handing out bottled water.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2-litre bottles in packs of 6 or 9. And they were instructing you to use it for drinking, cooking, and flushing the toilet. Bottled drinking water, which was all in army stocks provided by other water authorities. So my water was coming from Yorkshire, labelled Yorkshire water, for almost 2 weeks.
Wow.
And so I was lucky because I was stuck only one day. I managed to avoid flushing the drinking water down the toilet, literally. So I used it for cooking and drinking. Gave the rest of my share to the family of 3 next door. And I was lucky where I was working. I had to come past my ex-wife's house. So I would call in to the family for a dinner on a more regular basis and a shower, etc. But the other YouTuber that would be good on this is a guy called Beau of the Fifth Column. He's somewhere on the panhandle of Florida, and he visually looks like a classic rural redneck type, except he's sort of somewhere left of Lenin, I think. And but he comes up with a very flat description of various things that are going on, mostly US political, occasionally other stuff. So the latest one I've noticed from him, and I look at maybe 10% of his stuff, is about the call up by Putin because of Ukraine. And he comes up, he's been a journalist, but now he uses the YouTube as a way of getting his stuff out, as opposed to print. And he's pulled up that one of the regions have sacked their call-up man already because 50% of the people he was pushing forward weren't fit for service. Yeah, that's it. And he's on Facebook too. So there's a bit more chit-chat on Facebook than there is on YouTube. But one of his big things is sensible gun control. He's clearly a gun owner. He's ex-military type. And he teaches police gun safety at times, but has now stopped doing that because they just don't listen, apparently. Such that he has real stick for most Democrats about the sensibility of the things they say about gun control. But it comes over with, but you don't need to go deer hunting with an oversized magazine AR-15 because there's not much meat left at the end of it.
Yeah.
Right?
So just ruin it.
And it brings me back in some respects to, I'm working class. I'm the first of my generation and first in my family to go to university, for instance. And I've gone literally from a salaried 1%er to tonight, I'm going to go to sleep in that multi-story car park because I've got nowhere else to go and no money. And I can remember I was like 19 when I first went east of Suez, and I was going to do a month or so helping out in the Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan. Most of them had gone. Most of them had been integrated into their poor, as opposed to you're living in a tent. But I was visiting and helping out at the tent. And it's like, because they saw me as a white Londoner, you know nothing. They all wondered why I didn't jump at gunshots, because there's people with guns about and occasionally they use them. And it's easy. Where I grew up and where I lived in London, where my grandfather used to work, was the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock. So the Lee Enfield rifle is for Enfield and the river where that factory is. And things like the Sten gun and the Bren gun from World War II, the EN in those names is short for Enfield.
Oh, okay.
Right? So I've heard gunfire from the day, literally the day I was born, until I was about 21 when I left. And Chris said about those poor that have been beaten time and time and time again, and therefore see that there is no hope, not so much because the institution is built deliberately like that, but that's how the system is when you are really on that bottom 1%. And these people were literally being not 100%, but partly fed through UN rice being shipped out of India and Thailand. And then the rest of it was Red Crescent as opposed to Red Cross for Muslim. And or they were because the numbers of people in the camps was a lot less than it was, they started to put gardens up and stuff. But you know, you're in the desert, right? You're not going to get much. There's not much water anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's all piped from and trucked in. But it was really interesting to see the approach to as soon as they saw a new face. And it's like we all see things like the Band-Aid films and stuff where you get a white face turns up in Sub-Sahara and they all think you're a celebrity. And most of the time you're not. You're just a guy like me, or a woman like me, or you're a nurse or doctor, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But as the sheer grind is, even from my perspective, having you know serial nights in the car park or whatever, or derelict building or under construction huts and stuff, is they've been like that for like 10 years. And they look across the way, and there's like cousin third removed with his olive tree orchard or whatever, still managing to survive through. And it's like, how far can we stretch this family? How far can we stretch the community? And all I see is people are willing, but there's only so much they can do, because the top five, the next 5% up is still only like 0.5% over what you need to get by, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so things that the alternative way to run the village stroke town, what we came up with in our first book, and the mechanisms that are there, and talking about co-ops and Bow of the Fifth and stuff, the sideways into that I found before I found us, for instance, was that the shift from the US particularly being car focused to being community walkability. So the strong cities stuff, and then Jeff Spark or Jeff Speck with the health benefits of making it walkability,
Mm-hmm.
the environmental pollution benefits of making it walkability. He did a TED 5-6 years ago, and I found him via the Canadian who lives in Amsterdam, whose YouTube is not just bikes, and about half of what he does outside of transport talk and physical talk about bikes is where there aren't bikes and where there aren't a lot of bikes, these are the problems.
Mm.
So when he was still in Canada, he was living in New London in Ontario, sort of rings a bell, but maybe not. He couldn't walk to work from the bus stop when he got off the bus because the roadway didn't have a pavement. Right? And then he goes through, like 20 years ago, Amsterdam was like that. Even though we think of it as a cycling place, because you see the World War II pictures, and you see it caught the car bug, and then realised what was happening. It has gone back, such that what we might think of as a woman's bike, i.e., where there's no bar across from the handlebars to a seat, there's always a dip, so you can mount it easily. And yes, John, if you want that, have a look at Catherine Hayhoe's book on how to talk about climate change. Lakoff's framing how to talk about things is in there as well, as opposed to things we've been talking about. But they're not just by stroke for strong cities. All kicks off from the way you guys do the zoning with your cities.
Mhm.
And you have single family housing where you can't put a coffee shop up because it's only single person housing.
Right.
Whereas you look at almost anywhere in Europe, and I can remember I never went to a supermarket until I was like 15.
Mhm.
Go
Yeah.
down the road, there's a newspaper agent, cigarette place, bakery, greengrocer, grocery,
Mhm.
medical place, barbers, you know, the lot. Toy shop even,
Yeah.
you know, library, a lot. Anyway,
I think we have to wrap this up, but I think that is really interesting, Tim, about the I think that what you're talking about the livability of cities and the ability of people to get out probably also, you know, sort of translates into the ability to see people that are not yourself. Right. And that's one of the things that happened, and not so much in urban America, because there is still, you know, there are still businesses up against residential, but especially in suburbia, right, is that, you know, is that these things have been so removed from each other. And yeah, you have to have a car to get anywhere, to get the kids to baseball practice or, you know, or whatever. So yeah, I think that probably the ability to, you know, to have different types of people around would facilitate that, you know, would facilitate that type of, you know, that type of understanding of other folks that, you know, that we've been kind of talking about throughout this. But it is 11:38, so we are going to have to wrap things up. Anybody have a last word? All right, next time we will talk about the next section, and I will put this this chat up immediately, and sometime this afternoon there'll be a recording of this up on YouTube. So thanks very much. See ya.